Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Skull and Hat's Tales. I'm always curious to know where the people who watch this channel are from. So before you relax, consider leaving a comment. Now, let's get started. The vacation home looked perfect on the rental site, a cozy, rustic house nestled in a quiet, wooded area. The drive had been long, but the sight of the house waiting at the end of the gravel path made the effort feel worthwhile. Sunlight filtered through the tall trees, casting dappled shadows across the quaint wraparound porch. It was exactly the kind of escape I had envisioned. The key was where the host had promised, hidden in a small box near the front door. As I stepped inside, the smell of aged wood and faint lavender greeted me. The interior was charming, a blend of rustic and modern, with comfortable furniture and thoughtful touches. The creak of the wooden floorboards under my feet only added to the house's charm. I carried my bags inside and began unpacking, opening drawers to get a sense of the place. That's when I found the first item. It was tucked inside a side table drawer in the living room, a folded map, yellowed and brittle at the edges. Curious, I unfolded it and saw it was marked with small red circles and scribbled notes in the margins. The handwriting was faint, almost illegible, but a few words stood out: movements, unseen, and leave quickly. I frowned, placing the map back in the drawer. It was probably just a relic left by a previous guest. Shaking my head, I focused on settling in, eager to unwind after the long trip. As I explored further, I found more strange items. A stack of old photographs sat in the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser. The images were faded and grainy, depicting people I didn't recognize standing near what looked like this house. Their faces were blank, expressionless, and their eyes seemed to stare directly at the camera. On the back of one photo, written in the same uneven handwriting as the map, were the words, "Do not stay." I set the photos aside, a nervous laugh escaping me. People could be so dramatic. Maybe it was a joke or something left by the owner for ambiance. Still, a knot of unease had started forming in my stomach. I turned my attention to the kitchen, looking for a distraction, but the oddities continued. Behind a stack of plates in one cabinet, I found a bundle of handwritten notes. The paper was thin and discolored, the writing hurried and erratic. Most of it didn't make sense, but certain phrases caught my eye. "They don't leave," "sounds at night," and "stay only in the light." By the time I finished unpacking, I was more puzzled than concerned. The items were unsettling, yes, but they felt like relics from the past. Something that belonged to the history of the house, not my current reality. I decided to dismiss them as eccentric details and focus on enjoying my stay. That night I settled into the living room with a book and a glass of wine. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wood and the distant hoot of an owl. The peaceful isolation was exactly what I'd hoped for, and I began to relax. Around 10 p.m., I heard it, a faint knock. It was soft, rhythmic, almost polite, but unmistakably coming from the front door. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. I hadn't seen anyone nearby all day, and the thought of an unexpected visitor this far out unsettled me. I stood slowly, peering through the small window beside the door. The porch was empty. There were no cars in the driveway, no figures lurking in the shadows. I told myself it must have been the wind or a tree branch and sat back down, but the atmosphere in the house had shifted. The cozy warmth I'd felt earlier was replaced by an uneasy stillness. Later, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sound of footsteps, faint but deliberate, seemed to echo from somewhere below. I stayed frozen, straining my ears, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. "It's just an old house," I told myself. Houses creak, sounds carry. Still, it took hours for sleep to find me. The next day, I woke determined to shake off the strange events. I busied myself with a hike through the nearby trails, the fresh air and sunlight easing my nerves. By the time I returned to the house, I felt more grounded, more rational. Whatever had happened the night before had a simple explanation. I was sure of it. But the unease returned as soon as I stepped inside. The air felt colder than it should have, and there was a faint smell of damp earth that hadn't been there before. As I walked through the house, I noticed small changes. A chair slightly out of place, a cabinet door ajar that I was certain I had closed. I told myself I must have moved them without realizing. That night, the disturbances escalated. The knocking returned, louder and more insistent, followed by the sound of footsteps pacing the porch. I checked the window again, finding nothing but empty darkness. The lights flickered briefly, plunging the living room into momentary shadows before stabilizing. I revisited the notes, scanning the pages more carefully. Phrases like, "don't acknowledge them" and "stay silent" now felt like warnings rather than ramblings. The incidents they described mirrored my own experiences too closely to ignore. By the time I crawled into bed, I was no longer able to dismiss what was happening. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like I was trespassing. The morning brought little relief. The sunlight filtered weakly through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed heavier than they should have been. I tried to distract myself by making breakfast, but every creak of the floorboards or groan of the pipes made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, watching, waiting. In the light of day, I resolved to explore further. If the house held more secrets, I needed to find them. Upstairs, I searched the closets and drawers, uncovering nothing unusual. It wasn't until I ventured into the small storage room adjacent to the kitchen that I found something new, a suitcase. It was old, with a tattered tag still attached, the name on it faded beyond recognition. Inside were clothes, toiletries, and a leather-bound journal. The journal's pages were filled with frantic entries from someone who had stayed in the house before me. The writing described sleepless nights, strange noises, and an oppressive sense of being watched. One passage chilled me to my core. "If you're reading this, leave now. Don't make the mistake I did. They won't let you stay in peace." I slammed the suitcase shut, my hands trembling. The notes, the photos, the journal. It was all starting to piece together, but I couldn't bring myself to accept the conclusion. Someone had left in a hurry, abandoning everything, and I was beginning to understand why. That night, the disturbances reached a terrifying peak. It began with the lights flickering again, but this time, they didn't stabilize. I was plunged into darkness, the silence in the house broken only by the sound of something moving, heavy, deliberate footsteps on the floor above me. My breath caught as I stared at the ceiling, the thuds growing louder and more deliberate. Then they stopped, replaced by the faint creak of the stairs. Whatever was up there was coming down. Grabbing a flashlight, I backed into the corner of the living room, aiming the beam toward the staircase. The steps creaked under an unseen weight, but nothing appeared. I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no reply, only the continued sound of movement. The air grew colder, the flashlight flickering weakly. A door slammed upstairs, the sound reverberating through the house. My fear turned to desperation as I realized I couldn't stay another moment. Shaking, I bolted for the bedroom, throwing my belongings into my suitcase as quickly as I could. The noises continued, banging and thudding in a chaotic rhythm. My hands fumbled with the zipper, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, with my bag in hand, I sprinted for the door. The house seemed to groan in protest, the walls trembling as if they were alive. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath as I threw my suitcase into the car and sped down the gravel path. The road ahead was dark and winding, but I didn't care. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between me and that house. My headlights cut through the dense woods, the gravel crunching loudly under my tires as I drove faster than I should have. A glance in the rearview mirror made my stomach drop. The house was barely visible now, but the porch light flickered faintly in the distance. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows. I turned my eyes back to the road, refusing to look again. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing. The notes, the journal, the abandoned suitcase, it all pointed to something far beyond my understanding. I didn't care to unravel the mystery anymore. All I wanted was to forget. When I finally reached a small gas station hours later, I parked under the fluorescent lights and sat in my car, trembling. The attendant glanced at me curiously as I walked inside, but I avoided their gaze, afraid of what they might see in my face. I didn't even know how to explain what had happened. It started with small, almost imperceptible things. My roommate Alex had always been a little quirky, a night owl with a penchant for random hobbies. But lately, their habits seemed less like quirks and more like deliberate evasions. It began with their late nights. At first, I'd hear them moving around quietly after midnight, the sound of their desk drawer sliding open or their soft footsteps pacing the room. Soon, they started leaving the apartment at odd hours, sometimes not returning until dawn. When I asked where they'd been, Alex would give vague answers, just out, or needed air. Then there were the items. I noticed them in passing, things that didn't quite fit with Alex's otherwise laid-back personality. A roll of duct tape stuffed in the corner of the closet, stacks of notebooks filled with scribbles I couldn't make sense of, and a small padlock with no visible key. When I asked about them, Alex would shrug and change the subject. At first, I thought it was just the stress of finals. Everyone gets a little weird during crunch time, right? But the energy in our apartment shifted. Alex started avoiding me, cutting conversations short and retreating to their room with the door shut tight. Something was going on, but I didn't know what. It was a Wednesday when Alex disappeared. I came home from my morning classes to find the apartment eerily quiet. Normally, I'd hear the faint hum of their laptop or the clink of a spoon in a cereal bowl. But this time, nothing. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe Alex had an early lab or decided to grab coffee. But as the hours passed and their room stayed dark, I started to worry. I texted them, "Everything okay?" But the message went unanswered. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. By nightfall, concern turned to unease. Their laptop was gone, but their desk was a mess, papers scattered, a half-empty coffee cup growing cold. The closet door was ajar, revealing a pile of clothes hastily tossed inside, as if they'd been in a rush. The strangest part was the bed, neatly made with hospital corners. Alex never made their bed. I waited for 2 days. No texts, no calls, no sign of life. Their phone tracker, which we'd both activated for safety, had gone dark. It was as if Alex had vanished. By the 3rd day, I couldn't take it anymore. I told myself I was just looking for clues, something to explain their sudden absence. I started with their desk, rummaging through the disarray of notebooks and loose papers. What I found made my stomach turn. The notebooks were filled with dense writing, almost manic in its intensity. Pages upon pages of notes about unfamiliar topics, codes, coordinates, and fragmented sentences like "they know" and "no safe place." Some pages had diagrams of shapes I didn't recognize, interspersed with phrases written in what looked like a different language. The deeper I dug, the stranger it got. In the bottom drawer of the desk, hidden under a pile of old receipts, was a lockbox. It was small, with a sleek black finish and no visible key. Next to it was a folded piece of paper with a single sentence scrawled across it: "Trust no one." The closet held more surprises. Tucked behind their usual clothes was a duffel bag containing items that made no sense: a burner phone, a small vial of clear liquid, and a bundle of cash wrapped with a rubber band. I sat back on my heels staring at the pile of objects, my heart racing. This wasn't normal. None of it was. As I sat there, surrounded by Alex's things, a thought struck me like a lightning bolt. How much did I really know about my roommate? We'd been living together for months, sharing meals and conversations, but these items painted a picture of someone entirely different. Someone secretive, paranoid, maybe even dangerous. The notes were the worst. I spent hours poring over them, trying to piece together the fragments of Alex's thoughts. Some pages referenced observation protocols and contact procedures, while others contained hastily drawn maps with red circles around certain areas of the city. One note mentioned a date and time, tomorrow at 3 p.m., but gave no context. The deeper I dug, the more questions I had. Was Alex in trouble? Were they running from something or someone? And more disturbingly, had I been dragged into it just by proximity? That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the apartment felt amplified, every creak of the floorboards or distant hum of the fridge setting my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I couldn't say by whom or what. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the note with the date and time. Tomorrow at 3 p.m., it was too specific to ignore. Something was supposed to happen, and Alex had known it. But what? And why had they left in such a hurry? I spent hours pacing the apartment, trying to make sense of everything I'd found. The burner phone was useless, it wouldn't turn on, and there was no charger for it. The vial of clear liquid offered no clues, and I wasn't brave enough to open it. The lockbox remained sealed, its contents a mystery. One discovery stood out. Among the scattered notes, I found a receipt from a hardware store dated 2 weeks prior. Scribbled in the margins were the words, "Cover, obscure, relocate." The items purchased, tape, gloves, and plastic sheeting, sent a chill down my spine. What had Alex been planning? By midday, I decided to leave the apartment. I needed air, but more than that, I needed distance from the oppressive weight of Alex's belongings. As I walked through campus, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It was subtle, a flicker of movement in my periphery, the sensation of eyes on my back, but it was enough to quicken my steps. When I returned to the apartment, the tension was unbearable. I locked the door behind me, checked the windows, and double-checked the locks. Whatever Alex had been involved in, it felt like it was starting to seep into my life, too. The next day, the unease reached its peak. I woke to find my own belongings slightly out of place. My laptop shifted an inch to the left, my shoes arranged differently by the door. My stomach churned as I realized someone had been in the apartment while I slept. At 3 p.m., I sat in the living room, staring at the clock as the minutes ticked by. My heart pounded as I waited for something to happen, but the time came and went without incident. For a moment, I thought maybe it had all been in my head. Maybe Alex had written the note as a decoy, a meaningless breadcrumb. Then the phone rang. It wasn't my cell or the apartment phone. It was the burner phone I'd found in Alex's duffel bag. The sound was sharp and jarring, echoing through the silent apartment. I froze, staring at the device as it vibrated on the coffee table. After a few rings, it stopped. A moment later, it buzzed again, this time with a text. "We need to talk." My hands trembled as I set the phone down. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Whoever was on the other end knew I had the phone, and that alone was enough to terrify me. I packed my things that night, stuffing clothes and essentials into a backpack. I couldn't stay here, not with the phone, the notes, and the constant feeling of being watched. Alex had left me with a puzzle I didn't want to solve, and the risks of sticking around outweighed my curiosity. As I packed, the apartment seemed to close in around me. The shadows felt darker, the silence more oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, my eyes darting to the locked door. When I finally stepped outside, the night air felt both liberating and suffocating. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. I took one last look at the building before walking away, the light from our apartment window faint and distant. A part of me wondered if Alex was watching, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for me to leave. In the weeks that followed, I tried to forget about Alex. I moved into a small studio apartment across town, keeping to myself and avoiding questions from friends. I told them Alex had transferred schools or gone home for personal reasons. It was easier than explaining the truth, mainly because I still didn't fully understand it myself. It began as an unremarkable afternoon, a break in my routine. Wandering into a small thrift shop tucked into an alleyway I'd passed dozens of times but never noticed, I found it, an antique writing desk. Its wood was rich and dark, the surface polished unevenly by time and use. The carvings along its edges were intricate, almost hypnotic, as though crafted by someone obsessed with perfection. A modest price tag dangled from one of the ornate handles, as if daring me to resist. I hesitated only long enough to convince myself it was worth it. The desk would fit perfectly in the corner of my apartment, transforming the space into the cozy workspace I'd always imagined. The shopkeeper, an older man with a tired smile, barely looked up as I handed over the cash. He wrapped the receipt in a crinkled envelope, his only words a murmured, "It's got a history." The desk was heavier than it looked, and by the time I wrestled it through my front door, my arms were trembling. I set it down carefully and stepped back, admiring how it seemed to elevate the entire room. It was beautiful. Something about it felt significant, as if it belonged there, even though I knew it didn't. While cleaning it, I noticed subtle details. Faint scratches on the surface, almost forming patterns, and a shallow drawer that stuck as though hiding something. I tugged it free, finding only a faded scrap of paper inside. blank but brittle with age. It wasn't enough to unsettle me, just enough to make me wonder. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. That night, as I sat at the desk for the first time, running my fingers over the smooth grain, I felt a faint sense of satisfaction, a connection to the object that seemed oddly personal. I had no reason to suspect it was anything more than a lucky find. A few days later, as I walked home from work, I saw him, a man mid-40s maybe, standing just outside my apartment building. His clothes were plain, his expression neutral, but fixed on me in a way that made me instinctively look away. I slowed as I reached the door, fumbling for my keys. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but clear. "Do you live here?" I turned, uneasy but polite. "Yes?" "Did you by chance buy an old writing desk recently?" My chest tightened slightly, but I shrugged it off. "I did. Why?" His face didn't change. "That desk belongs to me. It was sold without my consent." I blinked, caught off guard. "I bought it at a thrift shop." The sale seemed legitimate. He nodded, his tone calm but insistent. "It wasn't. I'd like it back." I stammered an apology, explaining that I had no way of knowing its origin. He didn't seem angry, just determined. When I refused to return it without proof, he simply nodded again and walked away. For hours afterward, I couldn't shake the conversation. Something about him felt off, but I convinced myself it was just a misunderstanding. By the end of the week, he was back. This time, he stood outside the building in the early morning as I left for work. His expression was the same, though his tone carried an edge it hadn't before. "I'm asking again," he said. "The desk. It's mine. I need it back." I repeated my earlier response, trying to mask my growing discomfort. He was persistent, stepping closer but never crossing a line. "You don't understand," he said. "It's not just a desk." That phrase stuck with me all day. What did he mean? Was this some kind of scam? A ploy to guilt me into giving up something valuable? Still, when I arrived home that evening, I found myself checking the locks twice before settling in. Over the next few days, his appearances became routine. Sometimes he'd approach me. Other times, I'd catch him lingering across the street. His presence was never explicitly threatening, but it was impossible to ignore. My sleep suffered. I'd wake at the slightest sound, imagining him just outside, waiting. The notes started soon after. Slipped under my door or taped to the mailbox, they were brief and unsettling. "You can't keep it. This isn't over." The handwriting was sharp, almost frantic, each letter carved into the paper with heavy pressure. I saved them, unsure what else to do, and began avoiding the windows at night. Then one evening, I came home to find the desk had been moved, just slightly, but enough that I noticed. My stomach sank. I searched the apartment, my pulse pounding in my ears, but nothing else seemed out of place. The locks were still intact. I tried to convince myself I'd misremembered where I'd left it, though the explanation felt hollow. A few days later, I heard scratching at the front door in the middle of the night. Frozen in bed, I held my breath until it stopped. When I finally mustered the courage to check, there was nothing there, no sign of anyone, no note, nothing but silence. The next morning, I called the police. I explained everything to the officer at the station. The stranger, his claims about the desk, the notes, and the incidents around my home. The words felt strange leaving my mouth, as though I were describing someone else's life. The officer listened, his face unreadable, and nodded occasionally. "Do you have any proof he's been on your property?" he asked. "The notes." I pulled them from my bag, unfolding them one by one. He examined them closely before placing them into an evidence envelope. "This could be considered harassment," he said. "But without more evidence, there's not much we can do. Have you seen him on your property physically?" I hesitated. "No, but I know it's him. It has to be." He jotted down details about the man's appearance and told me they'd patrol the area for a few days. It was meant to reassure me, but the lack of urgency in his tone left me doubting they'd take it seriously. Still, as I walked home, I felt a small weight lift. At least I'd done something. That night, I bolted the doors and windows, then sat at the desk, staring at it. It seemed innocuous, almost mocking in its stillness. For the first time since buying it, I wished I'd never brought it home. The next day passed in an uneasy quiet. For the first time in weeks, the stranger wasn't outside my building. I scanned the street as I left for work, half expecting him to step out from behind a car, but he was gone. Even the notes stopped appearing. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of him. At first, the relief was overwhelming. I began sleeping through the night again, moving through my days without the constant shadow of fear. I told myself the police presence had scared him off, though deep down, I doubted that was the full story. Something about his persistence, his certainty, didn't align with someone who would simply give up. I tried to let it go, but the silence felt wrong, like a held breath waiting to exhale. The desk became a focal point for my unease. I started avoiding it, leaving papers and books scattered across its surface as though clutter could somehow dull its presence. The lingering unease eventually became too much. I needed answers. One night, unable to sleep, I began searching the desk for clues. I ran my fingers over the carved edges, feeling for anything out of place. In the back of the shallow drawer, where I'd found the scrap of paper, my nails caught on something. A panel. It took nearly an hour to pry it loose, my frustration mounting with each failed attempt. Finally, it gave way, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small bundle of papers, yellowed and brittle, bound with a faded ribbon. I unfolded them carefully. They appeared to be personal letters, written in a rushed hand that was barely legible. The contents were fragmented, but what I could decipher chilled me. Mentions of betrayal, desperate pleas, and cryptic warnings about what they took from me. One line in particular stood out. "The desk must never leave my possession. It is all I have left." The name signed at the bottom matched the one on the notes I'd received. I searched online for the name and uncovered sparse details. A man who had died under mysterious circumstances decades ago, his estate auctioned off in the years that followed. The desk must have been part of it, though why it ended up in a thrift shop was a mystery. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive, a long stretch of open road, music playing softly, and the promise of reaching my destination before nightfall. But somewhere along the way, I took a wrong turn. At first, it seemed like a minor detour, just a winding road through unfamiliar terrain. The sky dimmed faster than I expected, the horizon swallowing the sun in what felt like minutes. My GPS began to glitch, freezing on a blank screen before stuttering out contradictory directions. With no clear path forward and my phone service cutting in and out, panic started to creep in. I drove slowly, squinting at the dim outlines of the road signs, most of them weathered and unreadable. The surrounding landscape offered no help, just dense trees on either side and the occasional abandoned structure. The air inside the car grew stifling as my frustration mounted. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the faint glow of neon in the distance. A motel. Its sign flickered erratically, casting sporadic bursts of light that barely illuminated the gravel parking lot. The letters were half burned out, leaving only "Hotel" legible. It wasn't ideal, but the thought of continuing to drive aimlessly through the night was worse. I pulled into the lot and killed the engine, the stillness outside unsettling after hours of movement. The building was as dilapidated as the sign suggested. Paint peeled from the walls, the windows were smudged with grime, and the air smelled faintly of dampness and mildew. Reluctantly, I grabbed my bag and headed toward the entrance. The reception area was small and dimly lit, a single overhead bulb casting long shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor. A man sat behind the counter, slumped over a dog-eared magazine. He didn't look up as I entered. I cleared my throat, and his eyes flicked to me briefly before he pushed a form across the counter. "Room?" he mumbled, his voice flat. "Yes," I replied, unsure what else to say. The transaction was brief and perfunctory. He handed me a key attached to a chipped wooden fob and pointed down a dim hallway without a word. As I turned to leave, I noticed a faint chemical smell wafting from behind a door marked "Employees Only." It was sharp and sterile, almost masking the underlying mustiness that clung to the rest of the place. The room wasn't much better. The bedspread was faded and stained, the wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the carpet squelched faintly underfoot. I dropped my bag onto the bed and looked around. The single window was covered by a set of blinds that refused to close completely, leaving a thin gap through which the parking lot lights filtered in. A faint buzzing from the overhead fixture filled the silence. I told myself it was just one night. I didn't need comfort. just a few hours of rest before getting back on the road. Still, unease prickled at the back of my mind as I locked the door and slid the flimsy chain into place. The night refused to settle. I lay on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling as faint noises filtered through the walls. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, heavy and deliberate. Muffled voices murmured just loud enough to suggest conversation, but too quiet to make out the words. Occasionally, there was a scraping sound, like furniture being dragged across the floor. I tried to ignore it, attributing the sounds to other guests. It was a cheap motel, after all. But when I opened the bedside drawer in search of the remote, I found something that made my stomach tighten. A crumpled piece of paper, its edges yellowed and brittle. The words scrawled across it were brief but chilling. "Keep your door locked. Trust no one." I stared at the note, unsure whether it was meant as a warning or some kind of cruel joke. My hand shook as I placed it back in the drawer. I double-checked the lock on the door, even jamming a chair under the handle for good measure, before climbing back onto the bed. Sleep was impossible. The noises outside continued, louder now and more distinct. At one point, I thought I heard a faint tapping at the window. My breath caught, and I froze, listening intently. But it didn't come again. Hours dragged on, the clock's red digits moving impossibly slowly. Sometime after midnight, the pacing began. It wasn't the random movement of someone passing by, but a deliberate rhythm, back and forth, just outside my door. The steps were measured and slow, the kind that felt purposeful. I held my breath, the sound amplifying my growing paranoia. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. The hallway was dimly lit, but I could make out a shadow moving just out of sight. A figure loomed briefly near the neighboring door before stepping back into the darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stepped away, my mind racing through possibilities. Then I noticed the light. Faint and flickering, it seeped under the door of the room next to mine, accompanied by the steady sound of pacing. I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound, a soft, wet scraping. My stomach churned as I stepped back, every instinct telling me to leave, but no clear plan forming in my mind. The hours stretched on, each noise heightening my dread. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I just needed to make it to morning. The knock startled me awake. I'd fallen into a light, fitful sleep, still fully dressed, and now sat up in alarm. My heart pounded as the sound came again, 3 sharp raps against the door. I stayed silent, frozen in place, straining to hear anything beyond the thin wood. The hallway was quiet, eerily so, but I could sense someone on the other side of the door. Slowly I crept toward it, my breath shallow. I peeked through the peephole, my eye adjusting to the dim view outside. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I stepped back, I heard it, the faint jingle of metal. Someone was fiddling with the door handle. I grabbed the chair I'd wedged under the knob, pressing it firmly into place as the handle rattled. The chain lock vibrated faintly, the metallic clinking sending a chill through me. "Go away," I whispered under my breath, though I doubted whoever it was could hear me. After a few agonizing moments, the noise stopped, leaving a suffocating silence in its place. I waited, unsure of what to do, until my legs began to cramp. Finally, I returned to the bed, though sleep was no longer an option. I stared at the ceiling for the rest of the night, every creak and groan of the motel amplified in my mind. I promised myself I would leave as soon as daylight broke. At dawn, the tension in the air eased slightly, though my unease lingered. I decided to pack up and leave immediately. As I gathered my things, a corner of the mattress caught my eye. It was sagging oddly, as though something were wedged beneath it. My curiosity got the better of me, and I lifted the edge cautiously. There, hidden in the dust and shadows, was a bag. It was worn and scuffed, the kind of thing you'd take on a long trip. Inside were a few items, personal belongings that felt disturbingly out of place. A faded photograph of a young couple smiling in front of a car, a crumpled map marked with circles and lines, and a small, tattered notebook. I flipped through the notebook, the pages filled with hurried, fragmented entries. Most of it was illegible, but certain phrases jumped out at me. "They're watching. Never open the door after dark. If you see the light, it's too late." My hands shook as I shoved the bag back under the bed. Who had left it there? And why? I didn't want to find out. I grabbed my things, threw them into my bag, and headed for the door. But as I reached for the knob, another sound stopped me cold. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, just like the night before, but this time they stopped directly in front of my door. My fingers hovered over the lock, paralyzed by indecision. Then came the knock, louder than before, insistent. I held my breath, waiting. After a moment, the footsteps retreated, fading down the hall. I seized the opportunity, unlocking the door and slipping into the hallway. The hallway was deserted, the stale air thick with tension. I moved quickly but quietly, clutching my bag as I made my way toward the exit. The peeling wallpaper and dim lights seemed to close in around me, every shadow feeling like a trap. As I reached the lobby, I froze. Through the cracked glass of the front door, I saw them, figures moving in the parking lot. They were carrying something large and unwieldy, wrapped in what looked like a tarp. The sight sent a wave of nausea through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to get out of there. I turned back, my mind racing. The window in my room. It was the only other way out. I retraced my steps, my heart pounding with each creak of the floorboards. When I reached the room, I locked the door behind me and pushed the chair back under the knob. Then I hurried to the window, prying it open as quietly as I could. The cool morning air hit my face as I climbed out, my bag slung over one shoulder. I landed in the overgrown grass behind the building, crouching low as I scanned my surroundings. The figures in the parking lot hadn't noticed me, or so I hoped. Keeping to the shadows, I made my way toward my car, which was thankfully parked near the edge of the lot. I didn't look back as I started the engine, the sound startlingly loud in the stillness of the early morning. My hands trembled on the wheel as I pulled out of the lot, the motel growing smaller in my rearview mirror. The air was crisp as we gathered at the trailhead, a small group of strangers brought together by a shared love for adventure. I had signed up for this guided tour weeks ago, drawn by promises of breathtaking views and the chance to escape the monotony of daily life. The location was remote, so far removed from cell towers and highways that even the drive to get here felt like a journey into another world. The guide greeted us with a wide smile and firm handshake. He was tall and lean, his weathered face suggesting years of experience navigating the wilderness. His voice carried authority, each word instilling confidence that we were in capable hands. "You're in for a real treat," he said, gesturing toward the dense forest ahead. "This is a route most people don't get to see." We were a diverse group, some seasoned hikers, others with brand new gear that gleamed in the morning light. As we set off, the mood was light, filled with small talk and laughter. The trail wound through towering pines, their canopies filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. It was easy to forget how isolated we were, how quickly the trees swallowed up the view behind us. The guide kept up a steady pace, pausing occasionally to point out landmarks or offer snippets of local history. His confidence was infectious, and for the first few hours, I felt nothing but excitement. But as the trail grew narrower and the forest denser, a quiet unease began to creep in. The first sign that something was amiss came about an hour into the hike. One of the less experienced hikers stumbled on a loose rock and landed hard on their knee. The rest of us stopped, offering water and helping them back to their feet. But the guide barely paused, waving us forward with a curt, "We need to keep moving." It wasn't the response I had expected from someone in his position. A professional guide should have shown more concern, perhaps suggested a break, or assessed the injury more thoroughly. Instead, he seemed almost annoyed by the delay, his cheerful demeanor from earlier noticeably absent. As the day wore on, his behavior grew more peculiar. He brushed off questions about our route, offering vague assurances like, "We're making good time," or "You'll see when we get there." When one hiker pointed out that we were no longer following the marked trail, he grinned and said, "Trust me, the best spots aren't on the map." Most of the group accepted his explanation without question, but my unease deepened. The forest around us grew denser, the path less defined. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, watching from the shadows. The terrain became more challenging as we continued. What had started as a well-maintained trail now felt like an obstacle course, with tangled roots and uneven ground that demanded constant attention. At one point, we reached a narrow ledge overlooking a steep drop. The guide didn't hesitate, stepping confidently onto the precarious path and waving us forward. "Stay close to the wall," he advised, though his tone was more impatient than reassuring. The group hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. One by one we crossed, each step sending small rocks tumbling into the abyss below. My heart pounded as I inched along, every muscle tense. When I finally reached the other side, I felt a rush of relief, but the guide's expression remained unchanged, as though the crossing had been a trivial matter. It was then that I began to truly question his intentions. Why had he brought us this way? There were safer routes, I was certain of it, yet he seemed determined to push us further into danger, his gaze flicking between us, as though gauging our limits. By late afternoon, the guide led us to the edge of a rushing stream. The water was icy and fast-moving, its surface broken by jagged rocks. "We're crossing here," he announced, his voice leaving no room for debate. One hiker immediately protested, pointing out the obvious risks. "Isn't there another way?" they asked, their tone tinged with frustration. The guide's expression hardened. "If you want to turn back, be my guest, but I know this route, and it's the quickest way forward." His words silenced any further objections, though the tension was palpable. Reluctantly, we followed his lead, stepping carefully onto the slippery rocks. My boots were quickly soaked, the icy water seeping through as I fought to maintain my balance. Halfway across, a hiker ahead of me slipped, their arm plunging into the frigid current. They managed to recover, but their pale, trembling hands betrayed the shock of the cold. When we finally reached the other side, the group was visibly shaken. Tempers flared, with one hiker accusing another of rushing too quickly and causing the fall. The guide stood apart from the argument, his expression unreadable. For the first time, I noticed how little he seemed to care about the group's well-being. That was when it hit me. This wasn't just negligence or poor planning. There was something deliberate about his choices, a quiet calculation in every step he took. The realization sent a chill through me, and I knew I couldn't ignore my instincts any longer. After the tense crossing, the guide led us deeper into the forest without a word of acknowledgement. His silence weighed heavily on the group, now too tired and shaken to complain. I hung back, deliberately pacing myself to keep him in my line of sight. Something about the way he moved, calculated, deliberate, confirmed my growing suspicion. This wasn't just a poorly planned tour. We stopped for a brief rest at a small clearing, the sunlight fading fast and casting long shadows across the uneven ground. While the others slumped onto fallen logs or sipped water, I kept my attention on the guide. He stood a short distance away, examining a map that didn't look like the one he had shown us earlier. This one was smaller, marked with crude hand-drawn symbols and lines that made no sense. My stomach tightened as I watched him scan the treetops, his gaze darting back toward the trail we had just traveled. Was he looking for something or someone? I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but my gut said otherwise. The opportunity came when he walked a few paces away, pretending to examine the ground. I glanced at the map left peeking from his backpack. Without drawing attention, I edged closer. The symbols on it were jagged, almost frantic in their design, resembling something out of an amateur treasure hunt or a warning. Nearby, carved into the bark of a tree, I spotted similar symbols etched crudely into the wood. I wasn't sure what they meant, but one thing was clear: we weren't on any established route. My chest tightened as I realized how far off track we were. With no cell service and only his guidance to rely on, we were entirely at his mercy. The growing darkness made the forest feel more oppressive, the shadows shifting with each step as the guide motioned us forward. My mind raced, formulating a plan. Confronting him directly was too risky. His demeanor had shifted from authoritative to controlling, and I couldn't predict how he'd react if challenged. Instead, I decided to quietly alert a few group members I trusted and coordinate an escape. At our next stop, I whispered my concerns to a woman I'd been hiking near all day. Her eyes widened as I recounted what I'd seen: the mismatched map, the tree carvings, and the guide's strange behavior. At first, she dismissed it as overthinking, but when I pointed out how far off the trail we'd strayed, her expression changed to one of quiet fear. We roped in another member, a man who had been one of the more vocal critics of the guide. He agreed immediately, muttering that he'd had a bad feeling since we crossed the stream. Together, we decided to act if the guide left the group again, either to scout ahead or check the trail. The tension was unbearable as we walked. Every sound, a snapping twig, the rustling of leaves, felt magnified, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the guide was watching us more closely than before. I tried to act normal, keeping pace and avoiding his gaze, but my heart was pounding. The opportunity came when the guide paused abruptly, announcing that he needed to check the trail ahead. "Stay here," he said curtly, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness as he disappeared into the trees. The moment he was out of sight, I turned to the others. "Now," I whispered. "We have to go now." The three of us quietly urged the rest of the group to follow, explaining as quickly as we could that we didn't trust the guide and couldn't afford to wait any longer. Some hesitated, fear of the unknown keeping them frozen in place, but when I pointed out the faint outline of a marked trailhead in the distance, they reluctantly agreed. We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, the rustling of our movements painfully loud in the stillness of the forest. The marked trail was faint and overgrown, but the sight of it gave us hope. My pulse thundered as we retraced our steps, scanning the trees for any sign of the guide. At one point, a distant noise stopped us in our tracks, branches snapping, heavy footsteps approaching. We froze, our breaths shallow, but after a few agonizing moments, the sounds faded. Still, the possibility that he was following us spurred us forward, fear fueling our movements. After what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin, and the faint outline of a dirt road came into view. Relief surged through me, but I didn't allow myself to fully relax until we were all out of the forest and standing on solid ground. We flagged down a passing vehicle, a dusty pickup driven by an older man who looked alarmed at the sight of us. After a hurried explanation, he agreed to take us to the nearest town. It was a relief when the tenant signed the lease. The house had been sitting empty for months, draining my savings with each passing week. When the man showed up for the showing, a quiet, polite type in his mid-30s, I felt an immediate sense of reassurance. He introduced himself as Thomas and seemed genuinely interested in the property. His questions were practical, his demeanor respectful, and his references checked out without issue. The house itself was old, a little worse for wear, but charming in its own way. The creaky floorboards and musty basement were typical of its age, though I'd done my best to keep it in good shape. As we went over the lease terms, Thomas seemed almost apologetic for asking about the finer details, as though he didn't want to impose. He handed over the deposit and first month's rent in cash, which struck me as a little unusual but not concerning. At least, not at the time. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I stopped by once to drop off a package that had been mistakenly delivered to my address, and Thomas greeted me warmly, thanking me for the trouble. He mentioned settling in and how much he appreciated the quiet neighborhood. Everything seemed fine, and for a moment, I felt lucky to have found such an agreeable tenant. The first sign that something was off came during a routine maintenance visit. I'd arranged to check the gutters and make sure the old plumbing wasn't acting up. Thomas agreed to the visit without issue, though he seemed oddly reluctant to let me into the house. He lingered behind me as I moved through the rooms, his presence unnervingly close. At first glance, everything seemed normal, if a bit cluttered. Moving boxes still sat unopened in the living room, and the faint smell of dampness wafted up from the basement. But then I noticed small things that didn't quite make sense. A kitchen drawer left open with utensils scattered across the counter, a chair in the dining room slightly out of place, and one of the upstairs windows cracked open despite the cold weather. When I asked about these details, Thomas laughed them off. "You know how it is," he said, shrugging. "Still getting settled." I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Later that night, as I was locking up my own house, I thought I heard something faint coming from Thomas's property. A low, rhythmic noise, almost like footsteps. I dismissed it as the house settling, a sound I was all too familiar with. Still, it nagged at the back of my mind. The unease grew when I received a call from the cleaning service I occasionally hired for the rental. They'd gone to tidy up the basement, only to find several cleaning supplies missing: an old mop, a few bottles of bleach, and a box of rags. When I asked Thomas about it, he seemed genuinely puzzled. "I haven't touched anything down there," he said. "I barely even go in the basement. Too damp." His response seemed reasonable enough, but it didn't explain the missing items. Over the next week, I noticed other things disappearing: small tools from the utility room, a spare set of keys I kept hidden in a drawer. Each time I questioned Thomas, he feigned ignorance, his confusion almost convincing. Almost. The final straw came when I stopped by unannounced to pick up a ladder I'd left behind. As I walked toward the house, I thought I saw movement near one of the basement windows, a fleeting shadow that darted out of sight as quickly as it appeared. My heart raced, but when I knocked on the door, Thomas greeted me with his usual calm demeanor, showing no sign of alarm. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. "Of course," he replied, tilting his head slightly. "Why wouldn't it be?" I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling any longer. One evening, I drove by the house under the pretense of checking the mailbox. The lights inside were dim, but as I approached, I saw it again, a shadow moving across the basement window. This time, it wasn't fleeting. It lingered for a moment, hunched and deliberate, before disappearing into the darkness. I parked a block away and walked back, my pulse quickening with each step. Standing at the edge of the driveway, I stared at the house, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. It could have been Thomas, I told myself, or maybe just my imagination. But when I knocked on the door, he didn't answer. The house was silent, except for a faint creaking sound, like someone shifting their weight on an old floorboard. I tried the doorbell, then called his name. Still nothing. Just as I was about to leave, the basement door creaked open slightly, the movement barely audible in the still night. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I considered stepping inside, but the weight of unease pressed down on me, rooting me to the spot. Whatever was happening in that house, I wasn't ready to face it alone. The house gnawed at my thoughts for days. Every time I passed it, I felt an invisible pull, a mix of dread and morbid curiosity urging me to look closer. I told myself I had to investigate. If I was wrong, I'd simply feel foolish. But if I was right, if something was truly wrong, I couldn't ignore it. I waited until I knew Thomas would be away. He worked irregular hours, often leaving for stretches of time without explanation. One afternoon, I saw his car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the road. Seizing the opportunity, I parked discreetly and used the spare key I'd retrieved from home to let myself in. The moment I stepped inside, the atmosphere felt different. The air was heavy, tinged with an acrid smell that seemed strongest near the basement door. My hands trembled as I turned the knob and descended the narrow stairs, the faint creak of each step sounding louder than it should. The dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long shadows across the concrete floor. At first glance, the basement looked like any other, damp, cluttered, and unremarkable. But as I moved deeper into the room, I noticed details that made my skin crawl. Scratched into the walls were strange symbols, jagged and uneven, as though carved in haste. A wooden workbench was covered in makeshift tools, hammers, knives, and objects I couldn't immediately identify. The smell grew stronger near a corner where a heavy tarp was draped over something bulky. I hesitated before pulling back the tarp, my pulse hammering in my ears. Beneath it were old, stained blankets and what looked like a pile of broken furniture. But as I moved closer, I saw something else, a collection of photographs scattered across the floor. They were of the house, taken from angles that suggested they were shot from the inside. Some were recent, others seemed to date back years. My stomach churned. This was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was something far worse. I didn't wait for Thomas to return before calling him. My voice shook as I demanded an explanation, recounting the symbols, the tools, and the photographs. There was a long pause on the other end before he replied, his tone unnervingly calm. "You had no right to go into the basement," he said. "That space is mine." His words sent a shiver down my spine. "This is my property," I snapped. "I'm giving you notice. You need to leave." "I wouldn't recommend that," he replied, his voice low and measured. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." I hung up, my hands trembling. Fear coiled tightly in my chest as I realized the gravity of the situation. Evicting him wouldn't be simple, not legally, and certainly not safely. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in my own house felt amplified, every shadow a potential threat. The noises started again the next night. This time, it wasn't just faint footsteps or the occasional creak. It was louder, thuds and scraping sounds that seemed to echo from the basement. I drove to the house, my fear overridden by a desperate need to end this nightmare. When I arrived, the front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the night breeze. The inside of the house was dark, the air even heavier than before. I called out Thomas's name, but only silence greeted me. The sound of something crashing in the basement made me jump, and before I could second-guess myself, I moved toward the source. The basement door was wide open, revealing a faint light at the bottom of the stairs. My heart pounded as I descended, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The smell was overwhelming now, a mix of damp rot and something metallic. When I reached the bottom, I froze. The tarp was gone, and in its place was a crude arrangement of objects: candles, broken furniture, and more photographs, some of which now featured blurred figures in the background. In the center of it all was a single chair, its legs splintered, and the faint impression of someone's weight recently pressed into the dust around it. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. The basement was empty, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. Thomas never returned. The next day, his car was gone, and the house was eerily quiet. I changed the locks immediately, but the unease lingered like a shadow over my thoughts. I contacted the police, who arrived to investigate the basement. They took the photographs and tools, asking me countless questions about Thomas, but without clear evidence of a crime, their investigation stalled, leaving more questions than answers. It was an ordinary afternoon. I had finished my errands and was making my way through the busy streets, lost in thought. The air was crisp, and the usual hum of city life provided a familiar backdrop. But as I turned onto a quieter street, the atmosphere shifted. Raised voices cut through the ambient noise, drawing my attention. Ahead, two men were arguing near a parked car, their movements animated and aggressive. One was tall and broad, dressed in a dark jacket, his voice booming with authority. The other was smaller, wiry, and visibly distressed, gesturing wildly as he shouted back. I slowed my pace, unsure whether to intervene or simply pass by unnoticed. Then it escalated. The taller man lunged forward, shoving the smaller one against the car. The metallic clang of the impact echoed in the narrow street. A woman nearby gasped, clutching her bag as she backed away. I froze, heart racing, as the altercation intensified. The smaller man tried to fight back, but was quickly overpowered. I fumbled for my phone, instinctively taking note of details: the aggressor's dark jacket, his sharp features, the license plate of the nearby car. The woman hurried away, her footsteps fading into the distance. By the time I dialed the emergency number, the taller man had stormed off, leaving the smaller one slumped against the car, clutching his ribs. When the call connected, I described what I'd seen as clearly as I could, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but as I hung up, a prickling sensation crept over me. Someone was watching. At the police station, the air felt thick with tension. I sat in a small, sterile room across from an officer who listened intently as I recounted the incident. I described the altercation, the aggressor's appearance, and the details of the car. The officer nodded, jotting everything down with precision. "You did the right thing by coming forward," he said, his tone reassuring. "Incidents like this often go unreported." As I left the station, a strange unease lingered. The logical part of my mind told me it was simply the aftermath of witnessing violence, a natural response to the intensity of the situation. But as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the parking lot. It was empty. By the time I reached home, I had almost convinced myself that my nerves were playing tricks on me. Still, I double-checked the locks on my doors before settling in for the night. The memory of the aggressor's sharp features and piercing glare stayed with me. though I told myself it was unlikely he even knew I existed. The first few days passed uneventfully. I went about my routine, keeping busy and trying not to dwell on the incident. But then, small things began to stand out. On my way home from work, I noticed the same dark sedan parked a block away from my apartment. It was there again the next morning, its engine idling as I left for errands. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. But then, while walking through a crowded shopping district, I caught sight of a man in a dark jacket standing at the edge of the crowd, his posture stiff and his gaze fixed in my direction. When I turned to look again, he was gone. That evening, a knock at my door startled me. When I peered through the peephole, no one was there. My pulse quickened as I opened the door cautiously, finding only an empty hallway. It could have been a prank, I reasoned. But the unease grew. By the end of the week, the presence became undeniable. The dark sedan now followed me from work, maintaining a safe distance but always in sight. On another occasion, I spotted the man in the dark jacket standing across the street from my building, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. He didn't move, didn't approach, just stood there watching. Fear began to dictate my actions. I started taking longer routes home, changing my schedule and avoiding my usual haunts. But no matter what I did, the shadow of the follower loomed. At night, I lay awake, straining to hear any sound that might signal his presence. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside felt amplified. I knew I couldn't live like this, trapped in a cycle of fear. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't random. Someone from the incident, likely the aggressor, had discovered that I was the one who came forward. Their intent was clear. They wanted me to stay silent. But I wouldn't. Not now, not when I knew the stakes. I needed to act before it was too late. The moment I dreaded arrived late one evening. I had just returned from work, my nerves already frayed after spotting the dark sedan trailing me through half the city. The streets were unusually quiet, a heavy stillness hanging in the air. As I approached my apartment building, I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. My pulse quickened. He was there, standing across the street under a broken street lamp. The man in the dark jacket, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. This time, he wasn't trying to blend in or hide. He was making himself known. I fumbled for my keys, desperate to get inside, but before I could move, he crossed the street with deliberate steps, closing the distance between us. My body froze, the instinct to flee warring with the need to stand my ground. "You've been talking," he said, his voice low but sharp, like a blade cutting through the silence. "That's dangerous." I couldn't muster a response. My throat felt tight, my breath shallow. His eyes bore into mine, cold and calculating. "You didn't see anything," he continued, his tone laced with menace. "Do yourself a favor and keep it that way." He turned and walked away before I could react, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there. I stumbled into my apartment, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. My fear was now a tangible weight pressing on my chest, but alongside it was a spark of determination. This had gone too far. The next morning, I went straight to the police station. My resolve was shaky but unyielding. This wasn't just about me anymore. If I stayed silent, I'd be complicit in whatever this man was trying to cover up. The officer I spoke with listened intently as I recounted the events of the past week. When I described the man's confrontation and the vehicle following me, his expression hardened. "We've been looking into this case," he said. "Your testimony is critical, but it also makes you a target. We'll take steps to ensure your safety." They assigned a plainclothes officer to keep watch on my building and encouraged me to stay in touch with them daily. Knowing someone was watching over me helped ease the immediate panic, but the fear lingered. Every shadow outside my window felt like him, every distant footstep like his approach. That night, I packed a bag and stayed with a friend, avoiding my apartment entirely. The officers assured me they were closing in on the aggressor, but their words offered little comfort. Until he was caught, I couldn't let my guard down. Despite the police presence, he tried again. 2 days later, as I left a cafe downtown, I spotted him across the street. His hood was pulled low, but I recognized his stance immediately. He saw me too and began walking toward me. Panic surged as I darted into the nearest alley, my heart pounding in my chest. The narrow passage was a labyrinth of dumpsters and fire escapes, but I kept moving, hoping to lose him in the twists and turns. His footsteps echoed behind me, steady and deliberate. I rounded a corner and nearly collided with an officer in plain clothes. Relief flooded me as he quickly assessed the situation, pulling me behind him and radioing for backup. The man in the dark jacket appeared seconds later, freezing when he saw the officer. His hesitation was brief and he bolted, but it was too late. The officer and his backup closed in, tackling him to the ground. I watched from a safe distance as they cuffed him, his face contorted in anger. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of safety. The ordeal wasn't over, but the immediate threat was contained.